Hi, and welcome to the last video lecture of the semester. Today we're looking at a question that kind of seems obvious on the surface. It's a question of whether death is always bad or an evil, as Thomas Nagel puts it, and if so, why that is. So kind of like when we were looking at the terrorism question, this is an issue that we all kind of agree on the face of it. But when we delve into it, it's really hard to explain why that is, why we consider death to be such a bad thing. So in this short video for today, what we'll be looking at is Thomas Nagel's idea about why death is an evil, why death is in fact to be considered bad. And then we'll look at how that applies to some of the ethical issues that we've been looking at this semester. So to get to the question of why death is an evil or a bad thing for people, we need to look at what Nagel calls the natural view. This is just a view that we tend to take for granted as true on the face of it without really having to provide a lot of reasons why. So the natural view is that death is an evil because it brings to an end all the good things that life contains. So Nagel mentions this idea early on, and he's going to go forth through this excerpt that you have in the book to explain what those things are and how death deprives us of that. So what Nagel is not saying here is that everybody's life is good and wonderful, but rather that everyone's life contains experiences and possibilities, and the arrival of death ends those things continuing into the future. The thing that Nagel wants to focus on is the value of life for the subject, for the person who is deceased or who might be deceased, not for other people. So we could talk about how my death, for example, might affect my friends and family and how it would be a bad thing for them. But really what we want to think about is why it's bad for me to die. Why is it better for me to continue living than for my life to end? So what we need to do is to delve a little more into the notion of death itself and why we object to it. Specifically, Nagel is going to look at why we think it's worse for a younger person to die than for an older person to die. And also, he wants to look at what he calls this temporal asymmetry, the idea that our non-existence only is a problem after we've lived our lives, and we're not that bothered by the fact that there was a point in the past when we did not yet exist. So the reason why we object to death isn't simply because we wouldn't exist. If that was true, we would also view it as a great tragedy that there was a time prior to our own birth when we also didn't exist. So there's got to be something more to it than that, just something beyond just the fact that we simply don't exist anymore. What he ends up talking about and landing on is this idea that we're deprived of certain states, conditions, or types of activity. And he's deliberately construing this very broadly because he doesn't want to say that you must have a certain type of life or a certain type of experience or engage in certain types of activities for your life to be good or worthwhile. But we are deprived of whatever conditions make up our lives when our lives cease. So he says life is good. Again, keep in mind that he's not saying life is great or easy or wonderful necessarily, just that it contains good things that we would like to continue doing, even if those things are sometimes combined with less good things or suffering or bad things. The idea here is death deprives us of the good or tolerable aspects of life, and that's why we don't like it. So he really sees death then as a deprivation to the deceased, to the individual who does die, of the continuation of those pursuits and experiences that they had during their life. So it doesn't depend on it being an unpleasant experience or a harm to you. So what we want to avoid is thinking about what it would be like to be dead. Nagel is assuming, at least for the sake of argument in this work, that that's kind of a nonsense question, that the idea of what the experience of being dead would be like doesn't make any sense, because if you cease to exist, when you're dead, you're no longer having experiences. So it's not that the experience of being dead is unpleasant or harmful, because there is no such thing as the experience of being dead. So this goes to the idea that he talks about of what you don't know can't hurt you. Some people might say that death isn't harmful to you, doesn't cause any bad things to you because you're not around to experience them anymore. So he gives a couple of examples to illustrate this popular idea. One is the idea of the unknown betrayal. That's a hypothetical situation of a person whose friends are betraying him behind his back, but he never knows about it, right? So he's not actually personally being harmed by that. He's not experiencing any of the negative consequences of that, even though something we would consider bad pertaining to him is happening. Similarly, we have the person that he gives another example of, the person reduced to an infantile state. This is a previously highly intelligent person who, through brain damage, is reduced to the state of about a 3-month-old infant. Now, in that infantile state, this person is not unhappy. They're okay with their existence, just as a 3-month-old baby is content with their own existence in that state. So they themselves aren't aware of any deprivation. They're not aware of any harm committed to them because of the mental state that they're in. So these are all just illustrating the point that it is not the experience itself is unpleasant, but rather something that is being taken away from you or denied to you that makes death an evil and a deprivation. So to the example of the person reduced to an infantile state, what Nagel wants to say there is, it's not that he is unhappy or having an unpleasant experience in this infantile state that makes it bad or wrong. What the harm is, or what the deprivation is what could have been, what that person's life would have been or could have been if they had continued along their present trajectory of living a different kind of life as a highly intelligent individual. So what exactly are we being deprived of? That's what we have to figure out. So he says on page 440 that death is an evil that depends on a contrast between the reality and possible alternatives. So to go back to that example of the person reduced to an infantile state, that's what the real harm is. That's what the real evil is. Not a harm in terms of an unpleasant experience for that person, but that existence compared to what the possible alternative would have been in his fully functioning condition. So we're deprived of the time we would have had after death when we die. And that's the real harm. It's not that the experience itself is unpleasant. It's that we're being deprived of something good. And that's why he ultimately says death is unpleasant, it's an evil, and it's something that we don't want to happen. So one thing that's important to think about is the relevance of this question to ethics. So a few of you may have wondered, why are we talking about the question of death and why it's a bad thing in a course on ethics? So we all are going to agree that death is bad. Very few of us, I hope, want to die or are looking forward to death. So why are we talking about this here? Well, the idea of death as a harm or an evil is actually very important to our stance on a lot of ethical issues. So a lot of you in your papers are writing on issues that are very heavily dependent on how we think about death. Issues like euthanasia, war and terrorism, capital punishment. These are all issues that focus on death being wrong. So we have this sort of natural ethical truth that killing is wrong and that ending another person's life is wrong. And again, in this context, when we say a natural truth, we just mean something that we take as true on the face of it without really having to, or thinking that we have to take a lot of time to explain why that's true. So again, this is going to relate to these questions. So if we think that death is always harmful or wrong, then that's going to inform our stance, for example, on euthanasia. And if we have a patient who is terminally ill, whose life is going to end very soon, then the idea that by ending that person's life, we would be depriving them of a possible future may not apply, because their future is quite limited anyway by their terminal illness. Capital punishment, some may argue that it's always wrong to end a person's life because of that deprivation of their future. War and terrorism, we saw the impact of our views on death and dying there, specifically the harm to non-combatants. And we can even apply this to the idea of life-saving obligations to the world's poor, people whose lives are in danger because they lack basic resources like food, shelter, and medical care. If we think death is an evil that ought to be avoided and is a bad thing for people who do die because they're deprived of what might have been, what they might have been able to do and experience, then maybe that might inform our idea that we might have some obligations to make sure those people are able to continue living. Okay, so now what? Where do we go from here? Well, all you have left is the final exam. The format will be very similar, although not exactly the same as your midterm, and you'll get some more information about that from me shortly. And then you're done. You can have a great summer, and thank you for all your hard work.